Hey everyone, and welcome back to the distance learning version of our course. Today we're going to talk about Moore's proof of an external world. So last lecture we talked about external world skepticism and the arguments for external world skepticism. Today we're going to talk about Moore's response. G.E. Moore attempted to prove that there was an external world, thus showing that we can and do know that there is an external world. We do have knowledge about an external world, and therefore, external world skepticism is false. So, just a quick recap on skepticism. Skepticism about a topic is the view that you can't or don't have knowledge about that topic, and the external world is just the sum total of everything outside of your mind. So it's all external objects, where an external object is anything that exists outside of your mind. So that includes tables, chairs, other people, trees, animals, and your own hands, your own body. So your hands are external objects. If external world skepticism is true, then you don't know that you have hands, because the only evidence you have for your hands is that you can see them and hear them and feel them and touch them. But if all of your senses were deceiving you because you were dreaming or you were a brain in a vat or whatever, you would have all that same evidence, but you wouldn't have hands. So you can't know that you have hands if external world skepticism is true. And what Moore wants to do is prove that we do know that we have hands. We do know that there is an external world. External world skepticism is false. So, remember, the skeptic says you don't know that you're not dreaming right now. You don't know that you aren't a brain in a vat. You don't know there's no evil demon deceiving you. And if you don't know that you're not in one of those skeptical scenarios, then you don't know anything about the external world. Because if you were in one of those skeptical scenarios, all your beliefs about the external world would be false. So you don't know anything about the external world. Therefore, external world skepticism is true. So, let's play a game. Well, I mean, this is a YouTube video. We're not actually playing a game. But just hypothetically, pause the video, try it with yourself. Assume I'm a skeptic. I'm an external world skeptic. And I think that I might be a brain in a vat. I think I might be a brain in a vat. Prove to me that the external world exists. Prove to me I'm not a brain in a vat. Prove to me that you exist. Keeping in mind, I don't trust any of my senses. So I don't trust anything I see, hear, feel, smell, anything. How would you prove to someone like that? How would you prove to me, if I'm a skeptic, that I'm not a brain in a vat, that the external world exists? How could you prove it to me? It looks like it can't be done. Anything you say, I'll think might be part of my dream. Anything you do, any pain you cause me, any visual experience you bring up, any painting, conversation, anything, whatever, I will think it's all part of the hallucination. So it looks like you can't prove to me that I'm not in one of these skeptical scenarios. You can't prove to someone that they're not a brain in a vat if they think they are. Because no matter what you do, they could have that same experience as a brain in a vat. So how do you prove that you're not a brain in a vat, or prove to someone else that they're not a brain in a vat? And that's the question, and that's what Moore wants to focus on. Because Moore quotes Kant saying that it still remains a scandal to philosophy that the existence of things outside of us must be accepted merely on faith, and that if anyone thinks good to doubt their existence, we are unable to counter their doubts with a satisfactory proof. So that's a quote from Kant. And Kant is saying that it's a shame. It's a frustrating scandal, is the word he uses. A scandal in philosophy that if someone is a skeptic, we can't prove to them they're not in a skeptical scenario. We can't prove to them that there is an external world. That we just have to accept that the external world is the way it appears to us on faith, on sort of hope that our senses are not lying to us. Kant thinks that's a problem, and that we should be able to provide a proof of that. And Kant tries, and Kant fails. I mean, not to take sides, but Kant fails. Kant doesn't successfully prove this. So More wants to provide this proof. More wants to give us a way to prove that there is an external world. And More's proof is very simple. So here's the proof right now. Here is a hand. Here is another. Therefore, there are at least two hands. And therefore, there are at least two external objects. Therefore, there is an external world. End of proof. That's More's whole proof. And More says that now that we've seen that one proof, it's clear that you could give lots of different proofs. Here is a table, therefore there's at least one external object, therefore there's an external world. Here is a shirt, therefore there's at least one external object, therefore there is an external world. And so on and so forth. And that's More's proof of an external world. That's his whole proof. Here is a hand, here is another, therefore there are at least two external objects, therefore there is an external world. Whole proof. So, if you're anything like me, when you first read this or heard this, you found it unsatisfying. And you might think, is that a proof? Is that really a proof of an external world? We just looked at the skeptical arguments and they seemed pretty convincing. How does this prove it that there is an external world? Is this really a proof? And More's answer, obviously, is yes. Yes, it is. But he spends most of the paper defending the claim that this is a proof, or talking about what a proof is. So what is a proof? What does it mean to have a proof of something? What does it mean to prove that something is true? Now, you might think that in most cases you recognize a proof when you see it. If you take a math class, they'll prove lots of things, and those are pretty clearly proofs. The proof that the square root of 2 is irrational is obviously a proof. Once you see it and understand it, it's impossible that the square root of 2 could be rational. But in this case, it's not so clear that this is a proof. So what is a proof? More says that there are 3 conditions something has to meet in order to be a proof. Because ordinarily, when we talk about proofs, what we want a proof to be is an argument that guarantees the truth of the conclusion. To prove something is to give an argument that guarantees, that means you know for sure that it is true. And that's what mathematical proofs do, because they're mathematically rigorous and unassailable. So More thinks that in order to meet that condition, there are 3 requirements that an argument has to meet in order to qualify as a proof. The first is that the premise or the premises of the proof have to be different than the conclusion. Because a circular argument is not a proof. If the premise and the conclusion are the same thing, then you don't have a proof. So if More said there is an external world, therefore there is an external world, that would not be a proof, right? That would be a valid argument. And assuming there is an external world, it would be a sound argument. But like we talked about at the beginning of class, it would not be a persuasive argument. It would not be a proof, because if you didn't already accept the conclusion, you couldn't accept the premise. A circular argument can't make you any more sure of the conclusion than you already were before you looked at the argument. And if it doesn't make you any more sure than you used to be, then it's not proving to you that it's true. So it's not a proof unless the premise and the conclusion are different. So More just wants this first condition on a proof, More just wants the argument not to be circular. That's all we're asking for here. The second condition to be a proof is that the premise is something that you know to be true, rather than something you simply believe but aren't certain of, or something that happens to be true but you don't know is true. So you can't start with premises that you aren't sure of, because that's not going to prove to you that the conclusion is true. Because if you start with doubts, if you start with premises that you already doubt, then the proof cannot prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the conclusion is true. Because no matter how good the proof is, if you doubt the starting point, those doubts are going to trickle down. And so you need to know for sure that the premises are true in order for an argument to be a proof. You have to know the premises are true, beyond a doubt. Otherwise, the argument can never prove to you the conclusion is true, because there will always be doubts. And if you doubt the conclusion, if you're uncertain about the conclusion, then you haven't proved it. It hasn't been proved. It's not a proof if you're still unsure whether or not the conclusion is true. So to get that, you need the premises to be things that you know are true, things that you are certain of. So you can't just say, well, brains in vats are impossible, therefore you're not a brain in a vat. The premises and the premise and conclusion are different there. But you don't know for sure that brains in vats are impossible. Maybe they are possible. They seem possible. You can imagine it pretty clearly. It seemed possible in the Matrix when they talk about basically the same thing. So it seems like we can still doubt that premise. And so brains in vats are impossible, therefore you're not a brain in a vat, is not a proof, because we don't know for sure that the premise is true. So that's the second condition for a proof. The third condition is that the conclusion really does follow from the premises, where follow from means like valid argument, logically follows. The conclusion is, to use the fancy jargon, the conclusion is logically entailed by the premises. So you can't just say, like, 2 + 2 = 4, therefore there's an external world, because that meets the first two conditions. You know for sure that 2 + 2 = 4, and the premise and conclusion are different, because 2 + 2 = 4 is not the same claim as there's an external world. So 2 + 2 = 4, therefore there's an external world, meets the first two conditions that Moore talks about. But it doesn't meet the third. And the fact that it doesn't meet the third means it's not a proof. So the third condition is just that the premises have to actually entail the conclusion. The argument has to be valid, basically. If it's not a valid argument, then it can't be a proof. So the argument has to be valid in the sense that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is definitely true, right? So these are the three conditions for a proof. And they basically, if you remember what we talked about early in the class, they're what we talked about as a sound and persuasive argument. But not just a sound argument where you know the premises are true. So a sound argument only requires that the premises be true. Here, the requirement is that you know that the premises are true. So, Moore says that for an argument to be a proof, the premises and conclusion have to be different. You have to know that the premises are true, and the conclusion has to follow from the premises. And Moore says these are the only three requirements you need to meet for something to be a proof. To have a proof, your argument just has to meet these three requirements. And Moore says his argument does meet these three requirements. Because the premise and the conclusion are different, or the premises and the conclusion are different, because here is a hand, here is another. Well, those are certainly different claims than there is an external world. If you want to test that, take away your hands, put them behind your back. Now, there is no hand here in front of you, but there's still an external world. There would be an external world even if there were no more hands. If everyone lost their hands in some global tragedy, there would still be an external world. So here is a hand and here is another. Those are clearly different claims than there is an external world. So the first condition is met. And the third condition, we're going to skip the second for a moment. The third condition is also met, Moore thinks, because hands are external objects. And the external world is just the sum total of all external objects. So if there is a hand here, then there must be external objects. And if there are external objects, then there must be an external world. Simple, right? If there are hands, then there are external objects. And if there are external objects, then there is an external world. That all follows logically. That is a valid argument. So, Moore is right there. Or it sounds like his argument meets that third condition. That the conclusion really does follow logically from the premises. So that just leaves the second condition. Do you know the premises of Moore's argument? Do we know that here is a hand and here is another? Do we know that? Is that something we know for sure? Or is it something we just happen to believe but aren't certain of? Or is it something that happens to be true but we don't know? Well, Moore thinks, of course you know there's a hand here. How could you possibly not know? Look at it. It's right here. And if Moore's right, then it's a proof. Then done. There's an external world. We've proved there's an external world. But do we know the claim that there is a hand here? Moore thinks we do, and thinks that you couldn't possibly know anything with more certainty than you know that there is a hand here when you lift up your hands. And this is what a philosopher named David Lewis called a Moorean fact. It's one of those, and this is a direct quote from David Lewis, one of those things that we know better than we know the premises of any philosophical argument to the contrary. So a Moorean fact is something that we know with more certainty than we know the premises of any argument to the contrary. So Moore thinks that the fact that we have hands is a Moorean fact. We know that we have hands with much more certainty than we know any of the premises from the skeptical arguments. Do we know for sure that brains in vats are possible? Are you more certain of that than you are of the fact that you have hands? Moore thinks you shouldn't be. Moore thinks you should be much more certain of the claim that you have hands than you are of any of the philosophical claims made in the skeptical arguments. That brains in vats are possible, that if you were dreaming you would have all the same evidence, that there could possibly be an evil demon causing you to hallucinate. Moore thinks all of that is stuff that, yeah, maybe it could be true, but are you more certain of all that stuff than you are of the fact that there are hands here in front of you? Moore thinks the answer is obviously, or should obviously be, that you're more sure that you have hands. That's what you should be more sure of, rather than all the philosophical mumbo-jumbo with brains in vats and possible demons and more things. Forget all that. You should be much more certain that you have hands than that any of that stuff's possible. And so Moore thinks we should conclude from that we do know that we have hands. We do know that we have hands. And therefore, Moore's argument meets all three conditions of the proof. The premises are different than the conclusion. We know that the premises are true. And the conclusion follows logically from the premises. So, external world proven. And that's Moore's whole argument. That's Moore's proof. He thinks, here's a hand, here's another. Therefore, there are at least two external objects. Therefore, there's an external world. He thinks that is a valid proof of the external world. Now, is this proof convincing? Because it should be, because that's the point of a proof. So Moore has argued that an argument has to be a proof, an argument just has to meet these three conditions. He has an argument, it meets these three conditions. So he's proved that there's an external world. But the point of a proof is to convince that beyond a shadow of a doubt that something is true. And is the proof convincing? If you are already skeptical about the external world, would this help? And a lot of people have said no. The majority, I think, in the last 100 years or so since Moore wrote this. But Moore thinks that the reason that people say no, say it's not convincing, is because they want him to prove things that he hasn't proved, or even tried to prove. For example, he thinks people want him to prove his first premise. Here is a hand, and here is another. Moore thinks people want him to prove that there is a hand here. And he says, if this is what is meant by a proof of the existence of the external world, I do not believe that any proof of the existence of external things is possible. So Moore says, if what you want is a proof that here is a hand, then no such proof is possible. And a lot of people have said, yeah, that was the problem. Welcome to the club. Now you understand the issue. But Moore thinks that that's a mistake. Moore thinks that asking for a proof that there's a hand here is the mistake, that that's an error. Because Moore thinks that by acknowledging that he can't give a proof that here's a hand, that he's not giving up. A lot of people think that by acknowledging you can't prove here's a hand, that Moore's giving up. But Moore says he's not. Moore says, how am I to prove now that here's one hand and here's another? I do not believe I can do it. In order to do it, I should need to prove, for one thing, as Descartes pointed out, that I am not now dreaming. But how can I prove that I am not? I have, no doubt, conclusive reasons for asserting that I am not now dreaming. I have conclusive evidence that I am awake. But that is a very different thing from being able to prove it. I could not tell you what all my evidence is, and I should not require to do this at least in order to give you a proof. Or I should require to do this at least in order to give you a proof. So Moore thinks he has conclusive evidence that he is awake. He has conclusive reasons for thinking he's not a brain in a vat. But he can't even say what those reasons are out loud. He can't put that into words. And in order to prove there's a hand here, he would have to put that into words. He would have to be able to give us all of the reasons he has for thinking here's a hand. And he thinks he can't do that. And he thinks he shouldn't need to do that. Because Moore thinks you can know something without being able to prove it. And that's the ultimate point here Moore is making in a very roundabout way. Moore says you cannot prove there is a hand here, but you know it nevertheless. You know that there is a hand here, and you know it even despite the fact that you cannot possibly give a proof of it, because you can know things without being able to prove them. And this is true in mathematics, too. For example, there are lots of mathematical claims that I could prove. Okay, there aren't lots, there are like 3. There are about 3 mathematical claims that I could prove. I can prove the square root of 2 is irrational. I can prove that the set of real numbers is strictly greater than the set of integers. And I think I can prove the least number principle. That's about it. Maybe Euler's lemma, or maybe something. I don't know. There are like 2 or 3 I could prove, if called upon to do it. But there are more mathematical claims that I know that I can't prove. I know that the number 1 is greater than the number 0. I would have no idea how to prove it if I had to, though. How do you prove to someone that 1 is greater than 0? Either they know it or they don't. Like, I have no idea how you would prove that. And that should show that there are some things that you know but cannot prove, and that's okay. That the fact that I can't prove that 1 is greater than 0 does not mean that I should be a skeptic about whether or not 1 is greater than 0. It just is, and I know it. And I wouldn't be able to prove it if I had to. I wouldn't even know where to start, but I know it nonetheless, and you do too. And that's the takeaway here. Moore says you can know things without being able to prove them. And so the fact that we can't prove that there's a hand here does not mean that we don't know it. So even though we can't prove there's a hand here, we know for sure there is. So we shouldn't be external world skeptics or fall into the trap of having to prove that there is a hand here. And that's Moore's argument. So that's the end of Unit 4. That's the end of skepticism and knowledge and that whole segment. On Thursday, we will talk about bullshit and Harry Frankfurt's attempt to give a philosophical analysis of bullshit. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, stay safe out there.